this work that I do, helping people that have been scammed, this is all about the emotional impact of having been scammed and how you recover from that. The most important of all the emotions that come up after you've been scammed is shame. So I say it's the most important because when I talk to people, whether it's in person or over the phone, whatever it is, when someone's been scammed, the most prevalent emotion that I'm hearing in what they've been experiencing is shame. And it's shame over feeling stupid. It's shame over why did I miss the signs that this was a scam? It might be shame over things they've heard people say to them in response to that, and it could very well be shame that drives them to keep it secret from absolutely everyone that they know. And so want to talk about shame and talk about what that might look like for you, and hopefully something in what is said here is going to help you to start to overcome that, because it is a tremendously powerful emotion, isn't it? And so the thing I want to start with is something that I learned in reading Brene Brown's materials, her books, and listening to her videos online. And Brene Brown, that's Brene, and then Brown, Brown, if you're not familiar with her. But this thing that I learned from her long ago is how she describes the difference between shame and guilt. Shame, when we're feeling it, is applying what happened, applying the results of that to our entire person, who we are, our identity. Whereas guilt, we keep kind of isolated to the thing we did. So guilt is about something we did, but shame is about me as a whole person. And so how that applies potentially to you in having been scammed is that you might feel some guilt about this happening, and that might be you've lost money that would have, this impacts someone else that you care about, for instance, and you feel guilty about that. And shame, though, is pervasive and it's powerful. And what I'm finding is that people are, once they realize what's happened to them, the shame overpowers them and it leaves them feeling like they are a terrible person, a stupid person, that you can't be trusted ever again. You name it. Those kind of things are what's coming up. So hopefully what I'm hoping for you is that you start to notice what's coming up for you that has to do with shame, and accept that it's coming up, because it's not going to be as powerful over time, okay? But notice it when it comes up and start to challenge that. This happening to you does not mean that you are a stupid person, right? Don't apply it to your whole self, okay? So that's that about shame. Okay, so anger. Anger is the second most common thing that I hear people telling me about. So shame is first, hands down. That is almost every single person I've talked to is experiencing shame in some form. But anger is the next most common thing that people are feeling, and that anger is almost always directed right at themselves. So it's not anger in general. It's not anger at the scammer, which eventually you get there, by the way. You do eventually start directing that anger more towards the scammer themselves or the group of scammers, depending on what type of scam this was. But people start off always feeling very, very angry with themselves. And so I want to say, first off, that's very normal to respond that way, but there is a way through that as well. So some of that anger is related to the shame that we talked about before. So you're feeling all this shame and feeling like you're a stupid person, that you shouldn't have been fooled, you don't want to tell anyone, and there's no outlet, right? And anger builds up in you. And so I want to suggest a couple of things that you do about that anger. So accepting it is always first. Just acknowledge, yep, I'm angry, right? And I know that might sound kind of like that's not going to do any good. However, accepting the emotion right off the bat actually does help you to take a step further towards letting it dissipate, getting it out of you, right? And so acceptance comes first, and then I'm going to say start to challenge the reasons behind it. Look for those reasons behind it. And there's very, very likely to be some kind of thought distortion going on. And as an example, I always let people fool me. Quote, I always let people fool me. I always trust people first. That probably isn't 100% true. And so you challenge that and say, there are times when I don't do that, right? And so the way I tend to talk about this is get more realistic. Don't say things in your own head, in your own heart too. Don't say things to yourself that actually aren't true, especially if it's a thing that's going to make the anger worse or whatever uncomfortable emotion is going on for you worse. So that's the first thing that you do. Now, for some people, anger also needs an outlet. So they're able to process and get rid of anger more easily if they do something physical that helps them to burn it off, we'll say. Okay. So for some people, that might be healthy exercise, right? Get on a cycle and just pound it, right? Just go for it and cycle hard and get some of that energy out of your body, right? And for other people, some other form of physical expression of that anger. Don't hurt anyone, right? Never going to advocate for that. However, some kind of healthy physical expression of that could help you to let that anger dissipate a little bit and not feel so weighed down by that and uncomfortable with that. So there's a little bit that I wanted to add about anger, and that is the idea of reframing. And ultimately what this idea gets at is for you to allow the narrative about what happened to you to change a little bit. So reframing is a cognitive, a thought concept that has to do with taking what happened and seeing it just a little bit differently. A lot of times what a therapist is going to encourage is a reframe that is a little bit more helpful than perhaps the way that you had been seeing it before. And so this ultimately is a change in your narrative that you have about what happened to you. Let's think about a couple of examples of reframes. So one example is what I talked about earlier in the difference between shame and guilt, and taking that situation that happened to you, and rather than applying it to your whole self and saying, I'm a stupid person, right? Then you're saying, I made a mistake. I was fooled this one time. And it's a reframe that ends up being helpful for you because you're not applying it to all of you, right? Another example, and this is something that I hear pretty frequently when it's been a romance scam, is that people will start saying, well, I'm just not going to date. I'm not going to put myself out there because apparently I'm too gullible, I'm too easy to fool, and they start saying things like this to themselves. That's time for a reframe. It's a time to change that narrative, right? And looking at it more realistically, that you can take that and instead of saying, I'm too gullible to be out there, you can say, I've learned a lot after this happened, right? It's something that people tend to do is this happens and they realize it was a scam and then they start researching it on the internet and they're finding more and more examples of different forms that romance scams, as an example, will take, right? You learn a lot in that process. And so take what you have found out and use that and say, I've learned a lot here. I can do better going forward, right? I can take care of myself better going forward. I know more now. That's a reframe. That's a helpful way of seeing this situation.